Karl Marx exposed the hidden exploitation within the capitalist system and gave the working class the tools to understand their own power. In the heart of the 19th century, in a world convulsed by the advance of industrial capitalism, by the early labor struggles, and by the death throes of the old European monarchies, a unique voice emerged, a voice that not only tried to interpret the world, but aimed to transform it. That voice belonged to Karl Marx, one of the most influential and debated thinkers in modern history. Born in Trier in 1818, he was a rigorous observer of his time, but also an intellectual protagonist of its conflicts. His background in philosophy, heavily influenced by Hegel, soon found its path in a critique increasingly focused on the material aspects of social existence. For Marx, ideas did not float in a vacuum. They were the reflection and product of the concrete conditions of production, work, and power. Under this perspective, his thinking moved away from speculative idealism and turned toward a critical theory of political economy that would be developed throughout his entire body of work. Along that path, wage labor and capital occupies a unique place. This is not yet the mature Marx of Capital, but neither is it the young idealist philosopher of the 1844 manuscripts. This text, first published in 1849 in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, a revolutionary newspaper directed by Marx himself, functions as a transitional work. In it, we can already glimpse the critical framework that will structure his later thought, although still without the analytical precision he would develop later. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung was more than just a press organ, it was a political tool. Founded in the context of the revolutions of 1848, the newspaper was a platform from which Marx and his circle denounced the abuses of state and capitalist power, while proposing a radical reorganization of society. In that framework, the article Wage, Labor and Capital does not appear as an academic treatise, but as a political and educational intervention. The goal was clear: to offer the proletariat the conceptual tools to understand their situation within the economic system, and from there, to awaken a class consciousness capable of articulating a revolutionary project. Thematically, the text aims to demystify the relationship between the worker and the capitalist. Marx does not speak from a distance. He speaks directly to the workers, using a more accessible language than in his major works. However, this does not stop him from introducing fundamental notions such as labor power, surplus value, although he does not yet develop it with that name, and economic alienation. In this sense, wage labor and capital can be considered a gateway into Marxist thought, a bridge between denunciation and theory, between the concrete experience of the worker and the critical architecture that Marx would later build in Capital. The most revealing thing about the text is not just what it says, but how it says it and from where it speaks. Marx does not seek to convince through academic rhetoric or appeal to intellectual authority. His method is different. He reveals the workings of the capitalist system from the inside, from the lived experience of wage labor. By explaining that the wage does not represent the fair value of work, but barely the survival price of the labor force, Marx dismantles the illusion of equality that liberal capitalism had tried to build. This deeply demystifying gesture is one of the central pillars of all his subsequent thought. Despite its brevity and its somewhat more direct form, the text already contains a structure of dialectical analysis, a vision of social processes as dynamics in tension, in constant contradiction and change. Wage labor is not presented as a natural form of economic organization, but as a historical, temporary product that contains within itself the seeds of its own overcoming. That historical and critical perspective, which will be consolidated more rigorously in Capital, finds one of its first coherent and powerful expressions here. In terms of legacy, wage labor and capital represents a key moment in the genesis of Marxism. It is a work that has been read, cited, and debated in academic contexts, as well as in workers' assemblies, revolutionary circles, and university classrooms. Its simple language does not take away its depth. On the contrary, its ability to articulate complex concepts in understandable terms gives it exceptional pedagogical power. In that sense, it has functioned, and continues to function, as a formative and political tool. For all these reasons, this work cannot be understood as a mere minor appendix within the Marxist body of work. It is, in many ways, a foundational essay, a kind of economic manifesto that prepares the ground for the massive theoretical building that Marx will construct in the following decade. Its value lies as much in what it anticipates as in what it affirms, in its ability to connect theory and practice, in its insistence that understanding the world is also the first step to transforming it. To understand the world we live in, it is not enough to look at the surface, the laws of the market, the prices, the employment contracts, the payrolls. All of that seems natural, part of everyday life. But what happens if we stop to look closer? What is behind the wage we receive for working? What does it really mean to work in a capitalist society? Karl Marx, in this work, proposes a change of perspective, looking at the economy not from the point of view of the businessman, the bank, or the government, but from the place where all wealth is generated, human labor. What is the capitalist system, seen from the worker? Capitalism, in its most basic form, is a system in which one part of society, the owners of capital, meaning factories, land, machines, money, employs another part, the workers, to produce goods and services. But this relationship is not neutral. It is not a simple exchange between equals. Marx argues that it is a structural power relationship, where one owns the means of production and the other only owns one thing, their labor power. For the worker, this system operates under a very simple, yet brutally effective logic. If they do not work, they do not eat. They do not own their own means of production. They cannot generate their own income outside the system. Their only option is to sell their capacity to work to an employer. This is the essence of wage labor. Are labor and labor power the same thing? Here appears one of the most subtle and important concepts that Marx introduces, and which completely changes the way of understanding the economy: the distinction between labor and labor power. Labor is the concrete activity that a human being performs: building, sewing, programming, teaching, operating machines, caring. Labor power is the physical, mental, and creative capacity to do that work. It is something that lives in the body and mind of the worker. It cannot be separated from them. Now then, when a person is hired at a company, they do not sell their labor directly. What they sell is their labor power for a determined amount of time, and this has enormous implications. The wage the worker receives does not equal the total value they produce with their labor, but only the value necessary to reproduce their capacity to work. Food, transportation, housing, a little leisure to keep performing the next day. That is to say, the wage does not measure the real production of the worker, but the cost of keeping them available to work. What then is wage labor? Marx defines wage labor as that particular form in which the worker, who does not own the means of production, sells their labor power in exchange for a wage. But this transaction, which at first glance seems fair, I work, you pay me, hides a dynamic of value extraction. Let us look at a simple example. A factory worker works 8 hours a day. With their effort, they produce goods that, when sold, generate 100 euros per hour for the business owner. However, that worker only earns 20 euros per hour of work. Where do the other 80 go? That surplus, that value which is not paid to the worker, but which has been created by them, becomes profit for the capitalist. That difference is what Marx will later call surplus value, and it is the foundation of capitalist accumulation. The business owner does not make money simply by buying and selling products, but because they buy labor power at a lower price than the value it generates. In other words, wage labor is not a balanced relationship, but a form of systematic exploitation, even if it is legalized and normalized. Why is this relationship presented as natural? Marx insists that one of the main functions of modern capitalism is not only to exploit, but to hide the exploitation. It presents the relationship between the worker and the capitalist as a free contract between equal individuals. But the reality is that this freedom is fiction. The worker is forced to sell their labor power if they want to survive, while the capitalist has the power to decide who works, how much, and under what conditions. The wage, then, acts as a mask. It hides the fact that the value the worker creates vastly exceeds what they receive. And since everything is wrapped in legality and formality, the inequality seems natural, but it is not. From the perspective of the worker, The capitalist system is experienced daily as long and exhausting shifts, as a wage that is never quite enough, as the uncertainty of losing a job, as a life where free time is reduced to the leftovers of productivity. In that sense, Marx's analysis is not an academic exercise, but a tool to critically think about a concrete experience. Because if the worker understands that their labor power is the source of wealth, they can also begin to question why they are not the one who controls it. Understanding this first difference between labor and labor power, and recognizing how wage labor operates as a form of legalized exploitation, is the first step Marx proposes to awaken critical consciousness. This is not a neutral system, nor natural, nor eternal. It is a specific way of organizing production and social life, born in a determined historical context, and therefore capable of being transformed. When a worker gets their paycheck at the end of the month, it seems like a simple and fair exchange is taking place. Hours worked for money. It is an agreement, a contract signed between two parties that seemingly recognize each other as equals. But Karl Marx, in Wage, Labor and Capital, invites us to look more closely, to not be fooled by the surface. What appears to be a fair transaction is actually the reflection of a deeply unequal economic structure. One of the greatest achievements of the modern capitalist system has not only been its economic expansion, but its ability to present itself as something natural, logical, and fair. What Marx denounces in Wage, Labor and Capital is not merely a form of economic organization, but a system of ideas that justifies and perpetuates inequality. He calls this ideology a network of concepts that, repeated ad nauseum, hide the true social relations under an appearance of normality. In this sense, Marx does not limit himself to describing exploitation. He also sets out to dismantle the illusions with which capitalism disguises itself, especially two of them: the belief that the wage is the fair price of work, and the idea that capital is simply private property earned through hard work. One of the most deeply rooted ideas, and one of the most functional to the system, is the one that claims the wage represents the value of the work performed. From this view, if a worker works 8 hours, their wage would be the monetary equivalent to those 8 hours of effort. It seems fair, but it is false. Marx points this out clearly. The wage is not the price of work, but of labor power. This difference, which might seem subtle, changes everything. When we say that work is paid for, we assume there is a balance, a fair exchange. But in reality, what is paid for is the possibility of working, not the work already done. The worker puts their body, their mind, their time at the service of the capitalist, who does not compensate them for the real value that activity will generate, but for the bare minimum necessary to keep them in condition to keep working. Here the trick is revealed. If the wage were truly the price of work, capitalist profit would not exist. The company would have no margin. But since what is bought is labor power at a price lower than the value it can generate, the difference, the surplus, is captured by the capitalist as profit. This is what Marx will later call surplus value, and it constitutes the basis of all capitalist accumulation. Therefore, the idea of the wage as the fair price of work is not an economic truth. It is an ideological fiction designed to hide structural exploitation. Another deeply rooted idea is the one that presents capital as a form of legitimately acquired private property. According to this narrative, the capitalist is someone who, thanks to their ingenuity, their savings, or their hard work, has accumulated their own capital: money, machines, land, means of production. And now they have the right to employ others, generate wealth, and obtain profits. This image of the capitalist as the risk-taking entrepreneur is an essential part of the capitalist imagination. But Marx completely takes it apart. First, he points out that capital is not a thing, but a social relationship. Capital is not simply accumulated money, nor machines, nor goods. It is a relationship between people mediated by things. For something to function as capital, it must be used to buy labor power and generate profit through the exploitation of that power. In other words, a machine in itself is not capital. It becomes capital only when it enters into a relationship where it produces value through unpaid human labor. Thus, capital is not just property, it is power over someone else's labor. And that power does not arise from individual effort, but from a history of expropriations, violent accumulation, land appropriation, slavery, colonialism, and systematic dispossession. Marx will say this later in Capital. The so-called primitive accumulation of capital plays in political economy the same role as original sin in theology. That is, it is assumed, but never explained. Therefore, the idea that capital is just savings or personal merit is a useful fiction to justify the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few. The capitalist appears as a generous job provider, when in reality, they are the one who controls the means that allow people to live and only makes them available in exchange for extracting someone else's wealth. Both ideas, the wage as a fair price and capital as legitimate property, they form part of the dominant common sense, and it is precisely that common sense that Marx sets out to dismantle. Because as long as these ideas persist, exploitation can continue to exist without being perceived as such. Marx does not write only for specialists. His language, especially in wage labor and capital, is pedagogical. He seeks to show that these economic truths are not truths, but ideological constructions that benefit one social class to the detriment of another. His proposal is radical. In the deepest sense of the word, it goes to the root, and from that root, it opens up a historical possibility. The possibility of imagining a world where labor ceases to be a commodity and capital ceases to be power. In the dominant narrative, capital appears as a thing. It can be money, it can be machinery, it can be a factory, or even a stock share. This view, deeply rooted in traditional economic logic, leads us to think that capital is simply a resource accumulated by entrepreneurial individuals who put it at the service of production and growth. But in the work, Marx dismantles this conception from its foundations. For him, capital is not a thing. Capital is a social relationship. It does not exist outside a network of ties between people and classes. It is not about how much someone has, but how they use it to relate to others. More specifically, how they use it to appropriate the labor of others. He defines capital not as a sum of objects, money, buildings, tools, but as a dynamic process of exploitation. For capital to exist, a specific relationship must exist, one in which an individual or social group owns the means of production, while another only has their labor power. This is the heart of the matter. Capital can only exist there where there is wage labor. Without workers selling their labor power, capital produces nothing. Machines do not run themselves. Money does not magically reproduce, and goods are not created without human intervention. Thus, capital only makes sense as a social category. It is the control of someone else's labor through the appropriation of the means of production. In this framework, capital is born from the exploitation of labor. It is not the result of savings, nor prudence, nor business genius. It is the historical result of a process by which a social class, the bourgeoisie, has managed to concentrate in its hands the means that allow the production of wealth, forcing another class, the proletariat, to sell their capacity to work in order to survive. Here enters the scene one of Marx's most powerful contributions, the concept of the accumulation of capital. Unlike ordinary money, which can be saved or spent without generating relations of exploitation, capital is defined by its ability to valorize itself, that is, to become more capital. But how does this multiplication happen? Where does that extra amount that accumulates come from? The answer lies in the worker's workday. By selling their labor power for a wage, the worker produces goods whose value exceeds what they themselves receive in return. That difference, the surplus, is appropriated by the capitalist, who reinvests it, accumulates it, and turns it into new investment. Thus, the cycle begins again, expanded. Marx describes this process as a systematic appropriation of the value produced by others. The capitalist does not get rich through their work, but through their structural position. Their wealth grows as they can hire more labor power for less money, maximize productivity, and reduce the cost of wages. The capitalist cycle, according to Marx, is a constant process where money is transformed into exploitation and profit. Everything begins when the capitalist invests their money in two key elements: the labor power of the workers and the means of production, like machinery and raw materials. In the factory, the worker, using those tools, turns the raw materials into new goods. But the value of what is produced exceeds the initial cost, thanks to the unpaid hours of their labor. By selling those products, the capitalist gets more money than they invested, appropriating that surplus called surplus value. Thus, the cycle restarts, always expanding the wealth of some while perpetuating the dependence of others. It is not a neutral system, but a machine that feeds inequality. The owners of capital accumulate, the workers merely survive. And most importantly, for this cycle to be maintained, the worker must always produce more value than they receive. That is the basis of the entire system. If there is no surplus value, there is no accumulation. If there is no accumulation, capital does not reproduce. That is why capitalism constantly needs new ways to intensify labor, expand markets, automate processes, and reduce wages. Saying that capital is a social relationship also implies recognizing it as a form of power. Power to decide what is produced, how it is produced, who works, and under what conditions. Capital not only organizes the economy, it organizes the entire social life. It defines rhythms, hierarchies, priorities, values, and that power is not distributed equally. It is concentrated in the hands of those who own the means of production, while the vast majority only owns their time, their body, and their capacity to work. Thus, capital is not only an economic tool, but a structure of domination that shapes our societies from their roots. At the heart of the Marxist analysis of capitalism beats an uncomfortable truth. The relationship between capital and wage labor is not complementary, but antagonistic. It is a relationship based on dependence, but also on contradiction. While one expands, the other weakens. While one accumulates, the other survives. Marx does not limit himself to showing the exploitation of the worker. What he denounces is something deeper: the structurally opposing nature of the interests of the capitalist and the worker. This opposition is not the result of individual misunderstandings or specific injustices. It is the core of the capitalist system, its internal engine, its fundamental law. The greater the accumulation of capital, the greater the subordination of labor. In the logic of capitalism, all capital seeks to grow. There is no static capital. Accumulation is a structural necessity. Capital that does not expand dies. But how does capital grow? It does not do so by extracting more value from machines or from money alone. It does so by intensifying the exploitation of human labor. The more capital the capitalist has, the more labor power they can buy, the more they can control the production process, and the more they can discipline the worker. The great paradox that Marx points out is that while capital presents itself as a product of work, "I earned it with my effort," the business owner will say. In reality, it is labor that is subjugated to capital. Thus, capital does not free the worker. It subjugates them even more. Technological development, automation, global production chains, they have not eliminated human labor. They have made it more fragmented, more monitored, more precarious. The greater the accumulated capital, the greater the ability to extract value from the labor of others with less resistance. The concentration of capital is not just economic, it is a tool for social control. One of the great strengths of capitalism has been its ability to hide this antagonistic relationship under a mask of formal equality. In the labor market, the worker appears as a free agent offering their services, and the capitalist as an employer buying them. Both sign a contract, both agree voluntarily, no one forces anyone, everything seems fair. But Marx tears that veil with a single question. How much real freedom does someone have who owns nothing but their capacity to work? The freedom of the worker is, in reality, a forced choice. They have no land, no machines, no means to support themselves. To survive, they must sell their labor power to someone who does own those means. It is a freedom in conditions of necessity, that is to say, an empty freedom. Meanwhile, the capitalist appears as an employment provider, as a benefactor giving work. But what they really do is buy labor below its value and appropriate the surplus. There is no symmetry. There is no true reciprocity. What exists is a relationship of dependence covered up by a legal appearance of equality. Another mechanism that reinforces this inequality is the competition among workers. Instead of uniting to defend their common interests, workers are placed in a situation where they compete with each other for increasingly scarce and poorly paid jobs. This competition is not accidental, it is functional to the system. By maintaining an industrial reserve army, meaning a mass of unemployed or underemployed workers, capital can push wages down because there will always be someone willing to work for less. There will always be someone more vulnerable, more desperate. Marx warns that unemployment is not an anomaly, but a tool of capital to discipline labor. It is not a flaw in the system, but one of its gears. The more workers fear losing their jobs, the less power they have to demand improvements. Thus, the system guarantees its stability through constant precariousness. Furthermore, this competition fragments class solidarity. It divides the proletariat by origin, gender, age, educational level. It transforms the companion into a rival, the colleague into a threat. Unity, the only real weapon of the workers, dissolves into an every man for himself logic. And if all this were not enough, Marx points out an even deeper consequence of the capitalist system: the alienation of the worker. To alienate means to separate. In capitalism, the worker is separated from what they produce because it does not belong to them. They create objects, services, value. But those products are the property of the capitalist. They do not decide what they make, nor how, nor for whom. Their workday becomes a succession of repetitive tasks, without their own meaning, imposed from the outside. But alienation does not stop there. The worker also loses control of their time, as they must submit to strict schedules, imposed goals, external rhythms, and they lose even control over their body, which is treated as a tool, a commodity, just another machine inside the factory or the office. Thus, work, which under other conditions could be an expression of creativity, autonomy, and dignity, becomes an experience of emptiness and dispossession. The worker is not only robbed of the fruit of their effort, but also of their sense of self. Marx argues that this antagonistic relationship between capital and labor is not sustainable forever. The structural tension between the interests of the capitalist and the worker generates cyclical crises, social conflicts, outbursts, because capital needs to expand constantly, but it can only do so at the expense of labor. And the more this exploitation intensifies, the deeper the resistance grows. That is why the relationship between capital and labor is not just an economic issue, it is a historical struggle, a struggle between those who want to preserve their dominance and those who aspire to emancipate themselves. A struggle that crosses centuries, geographies, and generations, and that remains alive in every factory, in every office, in every place where someone works, without deciding what for or for whom. At first glance, capitalism may seem like an efficient system, a generator of wealth, innovation, and progress. The growth figures, the upward graphs, the technological advances, everything gives the impression of a model that, although imperfect, moves towards generalized well-being. But Karl Marx, with the precision of a social surgeon, forces us to look beyond appearances. In Wage Labor and Capital, he makes it clear that capitalism not only produces goods, it produces inequality, it produces relative poverty, and it produces crises. And the most alarming thing is that it does not do so by accident, nor through corruption, nor due to management errors. It does so because it is designed that way. It is its internal logic that drives these effects. Greater accumulation means greater imbalance. More production means more inequality. It is a brutal but real paradox. The success of capitalism is also its curse. Marx points out that capital has an inevitable drive to accumulate. Capital that does not expand stagnates. And as we have seen, that accumulation occurs through the appropriation of the labor of others. Therefore, wealth grows at the expense of poverty. As it concentrates in fewer hands, the working majority not only fails to proportionally improve their situation, but becomes increasingly subordinate to the dynamics of capital. The capitalists who manage to accumulate more resources can invest in new technologies, reduce labor costs, and absorb their competitors. The result is a greater centralization of wealth while small producers disappear and workers see their bargaining power decrease. Inequality is not a deviation of the system. It is a direct consequence of how it works. Economic growth is not synonymous with shared well-being. It is perfectly possible, and in fact frequent, for the economy to grow while the living conditions of the majority stagnate or even worsen. A fundamental concept that Marx introduces is relative poverty. Even when wages might increase in absolute terms, what matters is the growing distance between the working class and the capitalist class. It is not just how much a worker earns, but how much less they earn compared to the one who appropriates the capital. This relative poverty translates into visible inequalities in access to health, education, housing, and free time. While some enjoy the surplus generated collectively, others barely manage to sustain their existence. Furthermore, this inequality feeds a vicious cycle. The accumulation of capital allows influence over politics, the media, and educational institutions. Thus, the interests of capital become common sense, and the material conditions of the working class are naturalized as inevitable. Another structural effect of capitalism is periodic crises. Unlike other economic systems that tend to seek balance, capitalism needs instability. Why? Because it produces more than it can sell. Because by reducing wages to increase profits, it simultaneously limits the purchasing power of the workers. The consequence is an internal paradox. The system needs workers to produce, but it cannot pay them enough to buy what they produce. This contradiction generates crises of overproduction, full factories, saturated markets, massive unemployment, and most alarmingly, this situation is not resolved with planning, nor with justice, but with destruction. Companies go bankrupt, staff is fired, rights are cut, the system is restructured, but on the ruins of millions of lives. Marx already warned in Wage, Labor and Capital that capitalism is not a stable system. Its crises are not accidents. They are inevitable explosions of its own internal contradictions. In this context appears one of the cruelest, yet most effective laws of capitalism, the Industrial Reserve Army. It is a constant volume of unemployed or underemployed workers that serve to discipline the rest. This reserve army is not only a consequence of crises, but also a tool for social control. When there are more workers than available jobs, wages stagnate or fall. The threat of unemployment becomes a form of invisible coercion. No one wants to protest if they can be replaced tomorrow. Additionally, this mass of surplus workers allows capital to play with the labor supply, extend workdays, impose flexibility, evade rights. Fear becomes a productive force. The unemployed person is not just outside the system. They are an essential piece for its functioning. Finally, Marx denounces a deeply contradictory trend. Even if production grows, the worker's benefit does not grow proportionally. Even with technological improvements, increased productivity, and higher corporate profits, wages tend to stay near the minimum necessary for the reproduction of labor power. This is another trap of the system. More is produced, but people do not live better. The worker sees that their effort generates wealth, but they do not participate in it. Their wage does not reflect the value they create, but what capital needs to pay to keep them standing. This trend can be temporarily hidden with credits, subsidies, or artificial consumption. But in the long run, it reveals the exploitative core of the system. It does not matter how much innovation there is. As long as labor is a commodity, the wage will always be below its real value. Any critical theory that stops at the description of injustice runs the risk of becoming an impotent denunciation. Karl Marx, however, was never a mere chronicler of human suffering. From his earliest works, his thinking was guided by a deep conviction. It is not enough to interpret the world. It is necessary to transform it. Wage, labor, and capital is not just an economic analysis. It is, above all, a call to the conscious action of the working class. One of the central goals of the text is to provoke a rupture with the way the worker perceives their own situation. Marx knows that capitalist domination is not imposed only by force or by law. It is imposed, above all, through ideas, through common sense, through the false truths that the system repeats until they are naturalized. That is why the first step towards emancipation is to understand the exploitative nature of the relationship between wage labor and capital. It is not about a worker hating their boss or demanding better conditions. It is about understanding that the system itself is designed so that the worker produces wealth they do not control, and that this condition is not an accident, but a structure. Class consciousness, in this sense, is not just a feeling of injustice. It is a deep understanding of the place one occupies within a historical and economic dynamic, and of the collective power that can arise when that consciousness is shared and organized. From that consciousness, Marx points the way to action, the organization of the working class. The isolated worker is doomed to always negotiate from a position of weakness, but the worker who recognizes themselves as part of a class, who unites with others, who organizes their demands and their struggles, becomes a political subject. Here he introduces a principle that he will develop extensively in his later texts: the need for workers to organize as a class, not only economically, but also politically. Unions, strikes, cooperatives, and workers' parties are not ends in themselves, but ways of articulating a historical force capable of disputing power. In wage, labor, and capital, this horizon is already perceived. It is not just about improving wages or humanizing factories. It is about questioning the logic of capital, disputing the control of the means of production, building a new way of organizing work and life. That is the revolutionary dimension of the text. It does not promote a reform of the system, but its overcoming. And to do so, the working class must organize itself as a potential ruling class, not to exploit others, but to abolish the conditions that make exploitation itself possible.